Thank you so much. Well, I hope that gives everybody a perspective on the Catholic Muslim Studies program and what we're all about. And again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. So, for tonight's program, the format is going to be that first we will have one speaker speak for about for a short while, and then after that we will have our second speaker speak, and then after that there will be a fireside type of style chat that we will conduct. During this whole time, I encourage everybody who's participating to submit questions. You can do so through the chat box. Once after a short while, this fireside chat has taken place, we'll jump into the Q&A and we'll ask questions that you, the audience, may propose. And after that, we will end the program. So with that, I wanted to first introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Martin Nguyen. He is professor of Islamic Studies at Fairfield University. Dr. Nguyen's work revolves around Muslim theology, ethics, spirituality, Quranic studies, and the intersection of race and religion. So he is the author of Modern Muslim Theology, Engaging God and the World with Faith and Imagination. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Martin Nguyen.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thank you to the CTU for having me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be in conversation, especially on this topic of raising Asian voices in a religious dialogue. Um, I wanted to maybe frame my remarks by maybe flipping the theme of the panel a bit, right? Maybe instead of seeing it as a topic, frame it as a question. What does it actually mean to raise Asian voices in religious dialogue? And I'm hoping by reframing the theme, I can service some of the subtleties and complexities that underlie uh, what it takes to do this kind of work, especially when Asian voices are centered. I believe it's genuinely worthwhile, but can also be quite generative if we could try to press a little bit further. And so this questioning is going to revolve around three themes. I want to talk about this concept of Asianness. What does that actually mean? Concept of Orientalism and how that impacts the types of dialogues we have, but also the idea of Christian privilege or Christian hegemony and how the parameters of these conversations are often set. But before I turn to these points, I thought it was actually important to tell you a little bit about myself, who I am and where I'm coming from. I come to you as a child of Vietnamese refugees, and yet I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, down in the South. Moreover, on my father's side, they have been and continue to be Catholic for many generations back, and it's really this Catholic identity that I think was a catalyst for their twice over flight. Right, they were refugees twice over, first from the north to the south, and then at the end of the Vietnam War from Saigon to the United States. And yet I, on the other hand, are coming to you as a Muslim, one who is engaged in the work of theology. I see myself as trying to articulate a theological vision for how Muslims today can navigate the world. But I also see myself as an Asian American, in addition to being a Vietnamese American, two very distinct types of identities. And even though this Asianness is an imposition from the outside, right? To be Asian is something I think is foisted upon us by this American society. I think it's important that it become a source of solidarity. I'm also a child of the South, having been raised in Virginia. I was raised, in fact, in the vicinities of that city that was the capital of the Confederacy. So matters of race have always kind of been on my mind. It's been part of the experience that I've had to negotiate my entire life. And as an Asian American Muslim, I see myself occupying a very particular kind of place, maybe a liminal space within my own faith community. Something that I think helps maybe explain the particular take I want to present tonight. And so with that said, let me turn to this kind of first topic I want to kind of underscore. Maybe the problematic nature of what it means to be Asian and Asian American, especially as a Muslim, and then engaging in interreligious dialogue. And what's fascinating is that within the Muslim community, being Asian has an unsettling effect. What do I mean by this? Well, I think when you start thinking about this particular racial identifier of being Asian American, what does that actually do? What impact does it have for Muslims in the US? Who does it include and who does it exclude? And I think when we press on this question, you kind of see these other matters that are going to come to the surface. So I, being an Asian American, I think is pretty straightforward. Uh, as I said, it's this exterior imposition that for the non-Asian majoritarian society in the US, uh, you know, I can't be anything but Asian, first and foremost. My cultural specificity as someone who's Vietnamese in some ways gets marginalized. It's secondary or tertiary, right? When I walk into a space, I am classified racially, right, as an Asian, placed in a particular hierarchy. It's how Americans make sense of who I am, right? We are seen as our racial selves. In fact, I think the narrative of racialization is so strong in this country, right, that my being Vietnamese or even my religious identity as a Muslim is almost always overpowered, overshadowed by the monolith of this idea of Asianness. And when I enter spaces, whether it's the mosque or my university, when I'm in Muslim and non-Muslim spaces, I am read as Asian first and foremost. That Muslimness may never actually enter because of my name, because of my appearance, of my affect. I actually find myself wondering, right? Has anyone actually bothered to place me on a watch list? Do I have the right kind of name to trigger alarms and red flags? Am I being sufficiently profiled or surveilled because of my religious affiliation? People are so focused on the Asianness, they don't realize that I may be Muslim. If Muslims were suddenly rounded up, and we can think back to the days of the immigration ban and the fear that percolated there, would the forces that be actually know that I should be targeted as well? I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but I think I'm trying to raise a point here, right? What does it mean to be an Asian American Muslim? Now, to get back to that unsettling aspect of things, when I am looked at and others like me are looked at and read as Asian, we're a certain kind of Asian, an East Asian, a Southeast Asian. Muslims, at least in the American imagination, don't typically look like me. Muslim and Asian seem to be two very distinctive, non-overlapping categories. It doesn't work in the racial matrix that kind of constitutes this country. In fact, Asian American as an idea strikes me as a almost peripheral or superfluous kind of notion when I'm amongst Muslim Americans. It's a bit of a jagged fit. We don't really apply Asian American to Muslim Americans very often. It's hard to see it as a shared identity, and there's a lot of code switching that I would say goes on. And so I think there's two challenges here in just thinking about Asianness. First is the bizarre boundaries of what it means to be Asian in that Asian American sense. Of course, included within it are countries where Muslims abound, right? Malaysia and Indonesia within Southeast Asia, and then India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and many others, right, within South Asia. But it's really the brown-skinned Asians of the subcontinent, right, that belong to Muslim identification. I don't necessarily fit. And then what do you do about Arabs? Arabs squarely sit geographically within Southwest Asia, yet Arabs are rarely ever conceived of as Asian. In fact, for very political reasons, when Arabs first arrived to these shores, they made strategic moves to be classified as white. And in fact, today, right, when the U.S. Census is filled out, if you are of a Middle Eastern or Arab background, you check the white category, that particular box, rather than Asian. Geography then doesn't really kind of seem to define Asianness. But I think the real concern here isn't who belongs to Asian American. I think the second challenge, the one that I think eclipses this first one, is that Muslims themselves throughout the 20th and 21st century have become racialized into its own category. Muslims, right? What is supposedly a religious identity has now emerged as a distinct racial category. Eric Love, a scholar of Islamophobia, for example, has compellingly argued this point, that Muslimness itself has emerged as a racial identity that prevails over all other ones. The only exception, perhaps, is blackness. So what takes precedence isn't your ethnic origin, it's your Muslimness. That becomes what defines you. In fact, when we think about Muslims in America, we're always engaging with particular categories, subcategories, right? Blackness of Islam, the Arabness of Islam, the South Asianness of Islam. There's little consideration given to the other kinds of Asian Americans that are actually out there who call themselves Muslim. And so I just want to point out how messy Asian is as a category, that it collides with or perhaps butts up against this idea of Muslimness. And given the prevailing climate, the continued climate of Islamophobia, this pressure point of Muslimness is also what takes all of our attention. It's what draws all our identities together, right? It's never Asianness that brings people together to resist, to protest. It's always that Muslim inflection, the Muslim point that seems to be what brings things together. But I'm hoping by bringing this Asianness forward, when we think about interreligious engagement and dialogue, it's a kind of intervention that we're trying to trouble the waters a bit, trying to disrupt our notions of what is Muslim, that perhaps we can de-racialize the concept of Muslim. Um, but that's just something to think about. So let me also turn then very briefly to the second area of inquiry, this idea of Orientalism, that critical concept first articulated by Edward Said. And he was looking, of course, at Islam in the Muslim world and realizing that what is Orientalism but how the West imagines the Muslim other to be. And yet we know that it goes well beyond that. It encompasses all otherness, all non-Europeanness or non-Westernness, this idea of Orientalism. And like racialization, Orientalism is this exterior, this external imposition. What the West imagines, right? The Muslim East isn't just confined to places like the US and Europe. It's actually seeped out to the far corners of the world so that other non-Western countries are adopting very Orientalist attitudes. I think perhaps the most poignant and troubling example that comes to my mind is the way that China used the war on terror, the very language that we used to persecute the Uyghurs. And there's other cases of this, right? That oftentimes when non-Muslim Asians are encountering Islam, Orientalist tropes get recycled. They get brought back up time and again. Finally, there's this concern that I want to put on the table about who directs interreligious conversations. How do they occur? Who is setting the table? Who is at the head of the table? And more often than not, Christians are directing that particular dynamic. For Muslims in the US, given their current marginalized position, there's a very strong predilection to self-define and resistance and opposition to majoritarian norms, right? Whether it's the racialized political economy of the West, neoliberalism, capitalism, secularity, white nationalism in its many forms, there is this idea that we cannot be part of that we are not. In fact, we are subjugated, dominated by these particular forces. And yet wrapped up into that, given kind of the cultural norms that define this country, is Christianity. Khyati Joshi has done an incredible amount of work, right, on this idea of whiteness and Christian privilege, that they've become coexistence, right? She calls them two sides of a wide ribbon. And like Orientalism, this Christian hegemony kind of rose to the fore under the growth of Europe and European imperialism. And from my own experiences being in interreligious spaces, Christianity seems to get to define how we do those types of dialogues. It's about who gets to speak, where these conversations are held, and what subject matters, what theological themes become relevant and important, who gets to speak first. It's always assumed, though, that Christianity will be present and taking a lead role, setting the route and pace, so to speak, right, of the conversations, the engagements, the undertakings that are had. And of course, Islam is almost always present as well. Because when we put Christianity first, it almost always privileges an Abrahamic dynamic. Think of how so many interreligious engagements are defined. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim partners in conversation with one another. But I think if we actually start centering perhaps Asian voices as proposed by the theme, you can actually shift what interreligious dialogue looks like. It opens doors to other conversation partners. Think of all the religious traditions of South Asia. Jains, Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists can now become part of the interreligious conversation when perhaps the Christianity isn't sidelined, but de-emphasized for the sake of the Asian side of the equation. Of course, that might close some doors as well in terms of perhaps Judaism. But it's, I think, provocative, if not interesting, to think about how if we try to challenge the priority given to Christianity and try to imagine how else interreligious conversations could be, we might have a different type of table set. In fact, I think, by turning to Asianness, this notion of raising Asian voices, uh, it helps us kind of challenge what interreligious spaces can look like moving forward in the future. I think I'll stop there, and hopefully that'll give some food for thought for the conversation ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nguyen. Wow, a lot of food for thought, certainly. And again, to the audience, please feel free to type in some questions that you may have as our speakers continue to talk. So thank you so much again. Now, I'd like to introduce to you CTU's very own Dr. Joanne Haruko Doi. She's Associate Professor of Intercultural Theologies and Ministry. She grew up in Los Angeles, and she has nurtured her faith and education while spending some time in the intern during among the intern Japanese that were there in the past in the 20th century. She, among her publications, is the most recent one is the Japanese American Journeys of Remembrance, Identity, and Solidarity. And I am personally incredibly grateful to have Dr. Doi here, and so I'll turn it over to you. I'm sorry, you're muted.
It's like Zoom 101, the basic. Thank you so much, Saeed and Dr. Nguyen. You got my mind spinning. So I felt the same way when the question was posed, what does it mean to be Asian and Catholic? Both Asian and Catholic are huge ecosystems. So I am going to find my spot, and I have to begin with some personal stories. And I also realized listening to Martin that we also come from two different waves of Asian immigration. So my grandparents migrated at the beginning of the century, and I'm third generation Japanese American. I'm a cradle Catholic in a mission school and parish for the Japanese in Los Angeles during a time when we were marginated. So my father was in kindergarten in this parish. But maybe back up, I have these two funny stories. So lately I've been noticing in photographs how short I am. And that might seem odd to you, but mentally I think I'm tall because I was the second tallest girl in my class growing up. But it's because my school were all Japanese descent. So I just must have shot up quickly. So mentally I think I'm tall, but I'm really pretty short. And what does this then have to do with my religiosity is in the similar way, most families were like mine, that my father's side of the family was Buddhist. He himself was Catholic. But so with the extended family, we participated in both rituals, especially around honoring the dead, very naturally. And I thought that's what all families did. And in fact, the Maryknoll Parish Grammar School was never predominantly Catholic because of this dynamic. So it was created to serve the Japanese, marginated at that time Japanese in Los Angeles. So the same sense that I think I'm tall, I also think my Catholicity is a natural, I don't feel a conflictive nature in blending what is considered two religions. And I think, so I was in Peru among the indigenous, Aymara indigenous for about 11 years. And I think I understand it now in a similar way that their own indigenous religion is not a formalized religion, but it's a practice of life that you integrate in to live life to its fullest. So that freed me up when I was there because it felt so natural to me. However, that's not to say I didn't have some difficulties. So when I was 10 years old, I claimed this as my first theological thought. I had to understand why my Buddhist grandparents were not burning in hell because they were Buddhist, because that's what was taught in the catechism at that point. Um, and I actually did some scriptural reflections with the Gospel of John and God's unconditional love. I already knew they weren't, that was not a fact, but I felt like I had to justify it somehow theologically. So I'm going to draw a resource from my mentor and advisor, Fumitaka Matsuoka, who writes about amphibolous faith. And he claims this is faith that simultaneously exists in a person. It's not a binary of East and West, inclusive, exclusive, monotheistic, multi-theistic, orthodoxy, orthopraxy, but it's a relationship between things that are different. So it adds another faith to an existing one, even in contradiction. And it claims that reality is multiple, that even if we have different cosmologies, they can be in relationship to each other. So the value is then placed on connectivity and not binary contrasting either or. A connectivity in a web of existence in multiplicity. And the he calls it epistemological scaffolding, is first this ruptural liminality, and that's what you pointed to in our experiences of race, especially in this country. And because of that, we often have a sensitivity to pathos, to dissonance and dissent, that creates this exilic consciousness, but it also can foster solidarity and compassion. And then also this freedom to live this amphibolous faith. And then part of that, so there have been other terms in some Asian American theology, interstitial integrity. Rita Nakashima Brock, that within that liminality, there is an integrity. Interstitial refers to the space in between muscles. That seems like it's nothing, but if you don't have that space, the muscles will not actually work. Jung Young Lee talks about marginality. Peter Fan talks about in both or wait, what does he say? Both? Neither, in either, or in both, and both and beyond. And then Fumitaka Matsuoka talks about holy insecurity and then amphibolous faith. So within that, I guess in terms of being Catholic within all that, I have this quote by Merton. If you want to identify me and ask me what I think I'm living for in detail, and ask me what I think is keeping me from fully living for the thing I want to live for. So Thomas Merton was, oh my God, I can't remember what kind of monk he was, but he was a mystic and a prolific writer. And I feel like that question of identity helps me not have to settle in an either or understanding. So the aspects of being Catholic that nourishes actually the sense of identity is a sense of spirituality that you can actually need to inhabit ambiguity and uncertainty. And then Catholic social teaching that actually calls us into solidarity and compassion, to respond to those that sensitive to the pathos that we may resonate with and see. And in particular, Japanese Americans, because of the internment period during World War II, when 9/11 did happen, it was almost an immediate response at the same conditions. So 9/11 was similar to Pearl Harbor. Arab American Muslims were then racialized for their religion, just as Japanese Buddhists were identified. And then the threat of rounding them up, and detaining people. So I think immediately we did some solidarity work around just identifying with and supporting. And that continues to these. So now we have pilgrimages to the internment campsites that continue even after the redress bill in 1988, which was what my work was on. I needed to understand. I thought it was just a political strategy to get redress passed, and I realized, no, this is a practice that we need to continue. Redress was just one of the many steps to healing and to strengthening and to being in solidarity. So we return annually, especially to Manzanar. Tule Lake goes every couple years, but now more and more, all the sites are becoming National Historic Sites. So it's a place of learning and educating and solidarity. So on the Manzanar pilgrimage, especially CARE, the Muslim organization, is part of the pilgrimage, and is part of the interfaith ceremony at the obelisk. I'm not sure where to go now. Oh, I did want to add that there is a possibility of synergy and working together. And I often point to Our Lady of Guadalupe and Kuan Yin. So Our Lady of Guadalupe, who appeared in Mexico, that brought together the Mexican people really at a time when the indigenous peoples just wanted to die and not, so she helps create a new people. And then Kuan Yin is the bodhisattva of compassion. So they're both listeners to or hearers of suffering. And to just simply create a place for that enables a people to come into being. So I feel these two can have an alliance of compassion. And internally for me, I feel it can bring my Catholic and Buddhist heritages and ancestries together without collapsing them into each other. So I can hold them both in a kind of dialogy that helps move forward what it is I want to be living for, which is a compassionate and life of service. And Maryknoll also, I am a Maryknoll sister, and I think, how Catholic can I be? But Maryknoll's experience with peoples of the world, I think, gives a lot of space in our little ecological niche then to be at ease with and welcome God's created diversity in the world, however that's expressed. So I think I will pause there myself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Doi, for that for the insights. I wanted to bring back in Dr. Nguyen into the conversation, and perhaps if there's anything that you'd like to expand further, Dr. Nguyen, or even engage Dr. Doi on, I'd like to give you that opportunity, and vice versa as well. And again, to the participants, you can submit your questions directly to the Bernardine Center or to me, and we will see them, and then we can submit those. We can pose those questions to the panelists. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Nguyen, once again.
Sure. There's actually a couple things I'd like to offer. Inspired, Dr. Joy, by your remarks. I was struck, right, that we're from different waves of kind of Asian immigration, and yet there's some interesting parallels I noted, right, or some similarities, right, because you were talking about your own family being Catholic, but then having these Buddhist aspects to the family as well. Um, and so your upbringing is blended because I mentioned how my parents were both Catholic, but my mother's family was Buddhist and they converted to Catholicism as a matter of course, as a matter of coming to the US, right? The Catholic Church helped sponsor them and then they became Catholic. And so my own upbringing was to have multiple religions present, right? There would be incense burning, and then there would be a Buddhist ritual at an aunt or uncle's house, and yet there was also the Catholic service. And even now, right, as a Muslim, right, there's this kind of interreligious mix in terms of the religious environment around me. And it actually does make me wonder, right, that at least for some Asians, we have this rich interreligious experience kind of baked into our past. And maybe that's something that could be really fruitful for interreligious dialogue overall. Um, I also wanted to kind of go back to your reference to 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, because when I teach Islam America, one of the examples I bring up is related to events shortly after both of those historic moments. Um, if people recall, I think it was about a decade after 9/11, there was a lot of controversy and protests around an attempted building of a mosque. It was called the
Mhm,
Ground Zero Mosque.
mhm.
It was at an address called Park 51, but people were saying, well, this is inappropriate. This is not this is problematic. And when I teach that moment, I often bring up this case in Hawaii of a Japanese Shinto shrine that the federal government shut it down and would not return it to the Japanese Americans. And went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court eventually ruled that no, you have the community there has every right to reopen their shrine, despite right the history that happened in Pearl Harbor. So I wanted to kind of add that to the conversation as well.
Yeah, I want to know about that more. I
So
never
I'll
heard of
share some
that before.
details. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's regrettable we see these kinds of patterns, and yet it sparks our um, proactivity to respond to them. It's like we can't. I know the Japanese community, Japanese American community feels we can't not respond because we know we have that experience. And when it was we were going through things like that, friends were few and far between. So to be able to reach out is important for our identity now. Like
Yeah.
that aspect of solidarity is part of who we are now. So to regain your history and memory, even if it's a memory of suffering, isn't just to close back in on yourselves, but it's then to open yourselves to others, to open your horizons, which I think is part of what interreligious dialogue and or solidarity should be about, or friendship. In my class today, someone talked about interreligious friendship. If we can talk that way. Um,
You know,
Go ahead.
sorry, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead,
No,
please.
I was gonna say go ahead if you have a comment or question.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, it's a the you know it's related to what Dr. Wynn said, and it's for both of you. This idea of imposing this Asianness on to a person like yourself, and that it sidelines these other identities, being Vietnamese or being Japanese, being Catholic and being Muslim. And so as I was listening to this, I thought to myself, oh, is it problematic to lead with Asian? Is it better to think about it in a different way? Is it offensive to lead with Asian versus being more nuanced and being more specific to the ethnic identity markers? And so I was curious to but if you can help me understand or help us understand, how is it that you would prefer to enter a space, particularly a religious space, but any space, but when there are certain identities that are imposed and that you want to push back against?
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
oh, go ahead.
I'm thinking historically, Asian American, the term, it came out of a solidarity across ethnic groups. And
Mhm.
it wasn't meant to dilute your particular ethnicities, but realizing, we're all kind of suffering from similar conditions. Let's bond together as Asian Americans. So in that sense, it's a positive Asian coming together. If you don't dilute then and say everyone is just Asian. So
Mhm.
it's a both and, I think. One is a strategic, um, but you still want to bring your particularity, your diversity to it, which we do. And yet there are some things in common that we can enjoy together at a level where we understand each other. Um, I mean, being quote Asian. So I don't feel like it's imposed because I have that ethnic studies history, that it was a choice to come together and call ourselves Asian Americans rather than Orientals. So you have
Yeah.
to realize we don't want to be called Orientals, because that was imposed, Oriental rugs, Oriental things are things. So Asian American was a big step up. But, things evolve and change. So I don't know, maybe you have more contemporary, present moment understanding of how that term is used now. I don't know.
No, I was
Yeah.
going to echo the same history, right? That it was
Mm,
during the civil rights era that Asian Americans came and embraced that term to displace Orientals, or even more inaccurate, like Chinamen, right? Just things that were
right.
just completely off. Um, but I still think it's interesting that, as time has progresses, Asianness has settled in. It hasn't necessarily remained a source of solidarity, but I still think
Right.
it can be.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think when whatever one's specific cultural identity is, when you walk into a room, you see another Asian, regardless of whether they're Japanese, Vietnamese, Thai, what have you, there's almost an affinity, right? That there's a
Mm-hmm.
recognition that we have a shared experience of marginalization, perhaps, but there is something, or not even, it doesn't even have to be negative in the sense of marginalization, but we do have perhaps in terms of geography, culture, right? Something that does kind of bring us together. Um, it is a important connection point. And I think, when I imagine perhaps an interreligious conversation and everyone happens to be Asian but from different traditions, it would be a very different type of experience because there's already common ground
Mm-hmm.
that you can build upon. Actually, there was something else you had mentioned in your remarks too that I thought was really interesting is that question of salvation, right? You were talking about your grandparents and trying to think through that. And I feel that that's become a really live question for many Muslims in general, right? Living in this country with neighbors who are not Muslim, what is the salvation of our non-Muslim friends and neighbors and people in our community? And so, I'm thinking of the work of Muhammad Khalil and others who are really trying to tease out what does our tradition have to say about that. And I think that's a very productive touchstone, right, for this type of work.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about, you mentioned that given your parents' religious identity and then your own, and then Dr. Doi talking about her family and the amphibious nature, so to say, perhaps that there's this inherent interreligious dynamic that exists. And so one thing you said, Dr. Doi, is that you already knew that, the salvation question was answered, but perhaps you were just looking for some textual support to that. So this reverse way of looking at some of these issues within an interreligious context, it seems to me at least that the personal experiences drive the conversation in a different way. I mean, perhaps that fact that you already had a moment of settlement that yes, on the basis that they're not Catholic it doesn't matter, then that perhaps extends to other communities as religious communities as well, right? Or in your case, Dr. Wynn, the same thing vis-a-vis your parents. And so perhaps there's already baked, like to your point, there's baked in a way to do dialogue that really looks beyond even some of these things that could be markers of differentiation, and to getting to really the substance of understanding one another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so even to your inquiry about like walking into these interreligious spaces, right? So maybe what I would love to see happen is, rather obviously there's kind of the unavoidable first impression and kind of understanding of who I am, but almost an invitation to share stories from the get-go, from the outset, I think can go a long way. I mean, we both did that in our presentation. We told a story of where we come from and how we understand our experiences and our faith. So I think that could be a good, a helpful opening to these kind of encounters.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So there's a question here asking if either of you are familiar with the work of Tomoko Masuzawa and her book, The Invention of World Religions. And her thesis is basically that the very concept of world religions is deeply colonial.
Mm.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so, how might we look to deconstruct that concept in interreligious dialogue when we think about, particularly in our specific context, in your voices as Asian voices?
Well,
So
I was actually reflecting a moment ago that, that story about me thinking I'm tall, or that the scope of religious belonging was multiple and broad, was natural. then I realize I get to a point in my life where I'm doing this mental gymnastics, and suddenly I think, well, this is not my problem. You know, um, I mean, I don't have a dilemma with this, so I can understand, this invention of world religions that would make them, um, it never ceases to amaze me that world religions in themselves, we're exploring the mystery and reality of transcendent, the God, the divine, which is unknowable. And yet we create these categories that feel we can't mix them. Or maybe that's the invention of the world religions. Maybe it's out of a fear of and need for security rather than really embracing, um, kind of the creative, transcendent mystery of spirit that pervades everything and everybody. And wouldn't we want to just enjoy and get to know that rather than worry about if we're, well, I always tell people in my class, you have to stand for something, but you also have to leave something open, to make that possible. So the dialogue can go on internally, um, but it could also be a conversation. It doesn't have to be a dialogue of opposition or complete difference, but it can be a conversation of, it can be an intimate conversation. It can be friendship. So I don't know what I'm trying to get at, but I want to get the name of the author again, so you have to send that to me.
Yeah, I think on that note, right? I'm also unfamiliar with the specific work, but I've heard similar arguments, right? That and it's very clear that the concept of religion is deeply shaped by a particular Christian history, a very Protestant model. And so as we look at other world religions, they have to kind of fit into these particular categories. And so obviously, when you think about interreligious dialogue, right, that religious aspect, the religion that's there ought to be, in a sense, challenged. I think it could be actually very helpful to challenge it. Even within Islam, I don't know if there's a word that easily translates as religion. I think there's a concept called deen, and maybe unpacking that notion and how it fits could be very helpful. And maybe then in these types of engagements, what's needed is a certain degree of openness, right? To make oneself vulnerable and say, well, allow another tradition to explain itself, right? To move beyond just kind of basic literacy of what another so-called religion has to say, and allow that tradition to speak for itself, and allow yourself to try to stand in that position and to understand it with as much openness as possible. And that could be, I think that could be quite fruitful. I don't think it, I think it takes a lot of investment, right? It takes time. But you know, I don't think interreligious dialogue moves forward if we are just here for a quick fix, so to speak.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you're speaking about, partly and both of you alluded to before, is the issue of power and who has power. And so who gets to dictate it? And then what does it mean to decenter that power and center it in other places? And in our case here, center it onto Asian voices. And so, you know, what would that I mean, I'm trying to ask this in this way, like what does it look like to what would be something that you would propose is a different way of thinking through interreligious dialogue from your own perspective that that it changes. I know Dr. Wynn, you talked about maybe not talking about the typical things that maybe Christian centric types of conversations are frame into this dialogue. So what was something that isn't Christian centric? What is something that is Asian Muslim centric or Vietnamese Muslim centric conversation? Like what would be something that you'd want to talk about? And Dr. Doi, you too. Like what is it something that you'd want to talk about in an interreligious space that perhaps myself as a South Asian or somebody else as a Caucasian or as a Black American or whatever else may not even be thinking through or thinking about because of certain blinders that you can shed light on?
I think two things come to mind at your question. One is if we're going to take seriously kind of this a refocus, a centering of a different aspect like Asianness, like an Asian interreligious kind of conversation, and then perhaps rather than turning to religion first and foremost, you begin with the cultural connections, right? You begin with some sort of cultural practice or ritual, right? Gift giving or something along those lines, kind of set the terms or frame the nature of what's about to happen. And that could, I think it could vary depending on who is coming to the table. But I think the other idea I had, which is perhaps a bit bolder, is to abandon the dialogue. That it doesn't have to be kind of an intellectual conversation. Maybe it could be more experiential, where you participate, where you not in a kind of liturgical worship type of sense, but I feel there's different ways of understand, like just to walk into another worship space and try to appreciate what that is like. Um, I mean, yeah, let me leave it at that, and maybe I can circle back to it. But I'm just trying to imagine that it's more about trying to enter another person's community and then trying to understand what that life is like, and then having the conversation follow afterwards.
Ditto. Yeah, I think we're trying to get at what is meaningful for people in life and in death. And then so you start experientially. And then if you reflect together, then what helps support that or what enlightened, and then often your practices or, well, I don't know, even beliefs, but your convictions or what's meaningful for you can be shared. And then it might get to that level. Yeah, but yeah, I agree. It's, how do you enter into yeah, actually common practices that have significant spiritual significance that seems to cut across religion, so to speak. Um,
I mean, now I'm just thinking of a specific example, right, of what one could do or what a community could do. I mean, there's certain human experiences that are unavoidable, right? The loss of life, to lose a loved one. Um, and oftentimes when someone passes, we want to be there for their passing on. And so imagine gathering with others from different faiths, right, to experience how is the death of this individual going to be honored. There's elements that are cultural, there's elements that are religious that are going to kind of enter into what unfolds. But I can imagine that afterwards, right, the conversations about, well, how was this meaningful for you? How are you understanding, right, the absence or the moving on of this life? I can see that being very powerful because it's no longer just about abstract theological concepts and how rituals align, but you're now unpacking something that is deeply personal, and really based around relationships.
Mhm, mhm.
mhm. I think too, it's helpful if you do it collectively in a community.
Yeah.
I think because, well, Asian cultures are that way, rather than like here, you and me. I mean, I think that would be a good practice um, to actually do a community reflection together on that. Yeah.
When you say community, you mean
Or even
everybody?
even among communities,
Mhm,
um, which we've done, in terms of like we do go visit other worship sites and have sharings well, here among the students and the community there, and that's very fruitful. It's like how do you create the spaces of encounter to happen and friendships to happen, um, so that the ongoing conversations keep happening because you have fostered relationships
mhm,
rather than ideas about the other.
mhm.
I remember one person talking about, going towards the other. And I thought, other than what? Why do we create this otherness when it's really another person or, seeker or journeyer on the way together rather than this other that's so mysterious? Like, I'm just going to tiptoe in and try to understand a little bit and come back out.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah. I remember that struck me. And this person was, you know, benevolent in all good sense of the word, trying to approach the other. But it's always like, other than what? Why did you say other? You know.
I like your reframing as another, because it's something
Yeah.
that, again, it's a good way of kind of talking through that.
Hmm.
Absolutely. So another question, this person says, I lived in a mixed community. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and after a homily I heard from a Vietnamese confrere and homily, and I gave him some feedback, and you sounded like a true Vietnamese with a strong voice. His response was one of walking away. The Vietnamese are what is a way of thinking through that? I mean, I think that in what way do we? It sounds like that the question, or the question asker, is asking a comment in terms of centering different types of voices in this regard. And so I guess maybe it's a more of a comment than a question here. But I wanted to at least offer you both a possibility to final remarks before we conclude the program. And so I thought that if there's anything that you'd like to share with us, and where you think we where we should think about going, and as we orient ourselves or reorient ourselves towards different voices that can also that ought to have authority in conversations, be representative of our traditions. And so with Dr. Doi, I thought maybe I can.
Well, that last comment reminds me that, nonverbal communication is so key. And how does that enter into dialogue and, well, communication? So that would really be that kind of sensitivity has to be built into how do you read the room, so to speak.
Mhm.
And I think um, Asian cultures have a lot of that. I mean, I realized, I actually had Japanese class in this Japanese school once a week, but you don't use it, and I've lost most of it. But I realized I picked up a lot of the nonverbal training from my grandparents and my parents, and it comes up a lot, and I realized that manner of perceiving and communicating, um, communication is 80% nonverbal
Mhm.
and only 20% verbal. So what does that say about, you know, how we would do um, this? So I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I think for my part, I want to kind of build on some of the points we've been making, and share a story that was recently related to me. Because oftentimes when we think about interreligious conversations, we program it, right? It's kind of a regular occurrence, maybe once a month, or four times a year. We will gather together these partners and have these conversations. We want it sustained. And I think that's all very important. But then, thinking about, well, other ways of doing these things, it made me think about those beautiful moments where communities will express solidarity. And the story that had been shared with me was, if people recall, the attack in New Zealand at Christchurch, right, at the mosque. And so in a local community around here, a rabbi and 50 members of the Jewish community marched, right, to be in solidarity with the Muslim community. And that was a powerful gesture.
Mm,
I wonder, right, what if they then built upon that, right? To then say, well, let's convene again, let's gather again, and actually be in conversation, to actually prompt a religious dialogue after the memorial, after, right, navigating a crisis. Um, and the unfortunate thing is, right, we live in a world where crises are always happening, and we're always looking to be there for one another. So I think it would be a beautiful thing to imagine interreligious engagement. As a continuation of those powerful first gestures of solidarity.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's a really important point you're making, and it's something that I think is important, which is part of the video was about how do you do interest dialogue towards a social justice telos.
Yeah.
And that's important, because more than even learning about ourselves, but how do we get to a common good, and
mhm.
as the greater good. Um, and so that is very important. So I just want to thank you both so much for taking time out to have a conversation today, to help us to think about some of these important points that each of you have raised, about when it comes to not only interreligious dialogue, but intra-religious dialogue, and what it means to elevate voices that have been marginalized for a lot of different reasons, historically and presently. And I hope that, those who are on the call, on the program today, were able to take something away as much as I was. And again, I just thank you so much, Dr. Doy and Dr. Wen, for making time this evening for joining and and honoring us with your presence. So thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Yes,
I'm
Thank
thank you.
you.
It's been an honor.
Yes,
Mhm.
thank you. And I know it's 8 o'clock on East Coast time, so probably getting to golden hour if your daughter is asleep. So we don't want to keep you with us too long, and so you can enjoy that. And thank you so much. And for those in the Metro Chicago area and outside of this, please keep safe. And I know there's some tornado warnings, so please keep safe with that. And it's going to go from 70 degrees to 40 degrees, I think, with some snow. So stay warm. And so thank you again, everyone, and please have a blessed evening.